Welcome everyone. I know people are still taking their seats, so we can start informally, including our guest who was held up by the dean, which is a good sign when you invite someone. I'm Emily Cruz. I'm the Executive Director of the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Divinity School this, I don't know if it's afternoon, evening, it's not nighttime yet, this indeterminate time of the day when it is sort of dark and sort of not dark. At the Marty Center, we believe that the understanding of religion is critical to a functional society. Our programs move the expertise and rigorous research of the University of Chicago Divinity School beyond the academy, serving as a bridge between religious studies as a field and a phenomenon and the wider public. These programs include events like this evening's, tonight's, discussions with authors of recent books on religion and religious studies. This afternoon or evening, we're delighted to welcome Professor Jeffrey Kripal for a conversation about how to think impossibly, about souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else, published last fall by UChicago Press. Professor Kripal is the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, where he hosts the archives of the Impossible Collection and conference series. He also co-directs the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. Jeff is the author of numerous books, including the one we'll discuss as soon as I get away from this microphone. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the sciences, modern esoteric literature, and the hidden history of science fiction, collectively entitled The Superstory, Science, in parentheses, Fiction, and Some Emergent Mythologies. His full body of work can be seen at jeffreykripal.com, and also, in case you're wondering, he thinks he may be Spider-Man. Professor Kripal is joined by the Divinity School's own Professor Yousef Casewit. Professor Casewit is a Quranic studies scholar whose research interests include intellectual history of North Africa and Al-Andalus, Muslim perceptions of the Bible, and medieval commentaries on the 99 divine names. He has several publications, most recently, The Mystics of Al-Andalus, Ibn Barahan, and the Islamic Thought in the 12th Century. He is also the author of a critical edition of the Quran commentary by Ibn Barahan, published in 2016. I'm not sure if Professor Casewit thinks he could be Spider-Man or any other superhero, but maybe he'll tell us this evening. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Jeff, it's such a pleasure to sit with you here and to speak to you about your book. I've been immersed in it for a couple of weeks now. And last time we met was about 1.5 years ago at Esalen, and we had a very enriching series of conversations, and I'm just delighted to reconnect with you and to welcome you back to Swift Hall.
Thank you.
I feel like this is your I told you so moment, but I'll get there in a second. Your book is scintillating and subversive, a daring and brain-bending, troublemaking feat of intellectual rumination and metaphysical mischief. And I find myself in a kind of trance-like state as I read it, caught between awe and amusement. I won't summarize it, but there are jokes in it, there are pokes in it. No sacred cow is left unprovoked. It's enriching, it's challenging, it's frustrating, it's rewarding, and yes, it's offensive, but only in the best possible way, the way that cracks open new ways of thinking and leaves you deliciously unsettled. So what I would like to do, that's my impression, what I'd like to do is spend the next 40 minutes, beginning by asking you about your time here at Swift Hall, the 8 years that you spent here as a graduate student, and the time you spent with some of the patron saints of Swift Hall, Frank Reynolds and Larry Sullivan, Wendy Doniger, McGinn, and others. And then turn to the question of how this book fits into the broader arc of your work, and as you describe it, your intellectual spiritual activism. And then I would like to sort of just turn into one of the many themes that you discuss in your new book on Louis Massignon and Henri Corbin and the theory of the imagination. And hopefully that should leave a healthy amount of time for us to open the floor for questions from the audience.
Great.
So why don't I start by asking you about the time you spent here and if you can just walk us back to those days.
So that was 1985 to 1993. I was sitting out there. I came from a Roman Catholic seminary. I wanted to be a monk, and that did not work out for a whole variety of reasons. But one of the results of it was it really made me start to think about religion critically and historically, and so I came here. My joke is that the academy, you sort of back into the study of religion. Nobody grows up saying, I want to be a professor of religion. If your kid says that, that's a weird kid. Don't encourage that. But backing into it is good, and it made sense in the 80s. It was the only institution that would have me, to be really honest. Certainly the Catholic Church was not a place for me to go and ask the questions I wanted to ask, and they were very honest and open about that, and I appreciated that. But the Divinity School here was a place where you could go and ask really serious questions and essentially get away with it. I studied with Wendy Doniger. Wendy was my advisor. I also studied with Bernie McGinn. Bernie was on my dissertation committee because I came out of that medieval Christian background, and I spent a lot of time over in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations. And all of those people you mentioned were all, teaching at the time. Larry was here. I took courses with Larry, and I remember Eliade had just died. I never met Eliade. I knew Johan quite well. So those were really informative years. And I would say, just to go to this book and kind of answer your question, the attraction of it was you could think big. You could kind of think about religion as a whole. It hadn't yet taken this turn to specificity and cultural traditions and locality. There was a lot of people thinking about the religion with a capital R, religion as a kind of global phenomenon. And that was very attractive for a lot of reasons, but so was also the critical theories that were being introduced at that point. So it was a mix. And over the years, I think this is like the 8th or 9th book with the press. This book really comes out of a former one I wrote called The Superhumanities, and both of those books really find their origin in the dean's office at Rice University. I spent 4 years in a dean's office as an associate dean, and I was in charge of looking out at doctoral programs really across the School of Humanities, mostly in English, history, art history, philosophy, and religion. And I was responsible for those doctoral programs, and I became very concerned about the state of the humanities, both at the university, which was very and is very supportive of the humanities, but the broader culture, the broader sense of higher education in America. And I began to feel that humanists don't really have a big story to tell. We don't really have a way to answer the scientists. And I became very concerned about that. And so it was really a sort of moral impulse to try to get humanists and historians and philosophers to start talking about the humanities as a whole. And what happened was my editor over at the press, a man named Kyle Wagner, basically said, well, how do we do this? Why don't you write a book about how to do the superhumanities? And he came up with the title, How to Think Impossibly. It's a great title, but it's not mine, it's his. And then I basically put a collection of essays I had given at different universities over the last few years and kind of wrote around that question of how do we think impossibly and what does that mean? And basically what it means, to sort of give away the shop, is that don't think in terms of a specific religion, don't think in terms of a specific science, don't think in any way you're comfortable with, think outside that. And thinking impossibly is basically being reflexive and critical about one's own worldview and not really settling into a particular model of what is possible. And the other idea behind the book is really comes from talking to human beings who have experiences that don't fit in to their cultures and don't fit in really anywhere, but they still happen. And I became very convinced that the impossible was really a function of our worldview. It wasn't a function of human experience or what the human being was capable of. And so this book is really a kind of attempt to lay the history out of what impossible phenomena look like, but also how to theorize them and how to think about them and how we can transform the humanities if we took these experiences more seriously and took them in.
Thank you. So the seeds of the arc of your work, would you say, are here at Swift Hall from your graduate education? Is there more on that you'd like to talk about before?
I mean, pretty much everything I do is because of Swift Hall. Actually, I don't mean to be cheesy about it or praise the university, but it really was remarkable, and I really don't see that. I don't see that capaciousness and that generosity mirrored, in the academy or in the public culture today. I just don't. If somebody else sees it, great, but I don't see it. And I really felt it, and I really saw it modeled here in the late 80s and 90s, and everything I do is sort of a response to that.
Perhaps we could turn to Corbin, Massignon, jump right into a theory of the imagination. I mean, this is where some of my work sort of intersects with yours. Many passages in your book, so your call for a capacious theory of the imagination that can somehow contain or hold phenomena that we deem impossible is partly inspired by Corbin's work on what he called the imaginal, and in some ways the French language is a bit more capacious than the English language. L'imaginal, l'imaginaire, there are certain, I think, like words, connaissance versus certain words you can use to carry some of the modes of knowledge that Corbin himself was trying to express in the French language based on the Arabic and Persian sources he was working with. And so could you just start by sharing what you mean, or in what ways Corbin's theory of the imagination or the imaginal realm helps you think impossibly?
So the book begins, as you know, it begins at Esalen actually, and I invited a bunch of academics. They were all academics from all over the country, and I asked them to come with two things. I said, come with the weirdest thing that ever happened to you, and then come with a theory of the imagination that can help us make sense of that weird thing. They all came with a drop your jaw story. I mean, weird shit, okay? Nobody came with a theory of the imagination. Nobody. Not one single intellectual had a clue what to do with their experience. And so I came out of that, I mean, this is years ago, I'm looking back on it now, obviously. But I don't think we have a theory of the imagination, I really don't. And the Corbin stuff, the imaginal, what I wanted to say in that chapter was Corbin tried, and I had read a lot of Corbin actually here with Larry Sullivan, and I had written about Corbin's mentor, a man named Louis Massignon, kind of a post-colonial critic, but also a mystic. And I had written a book on the mystical experiences of scholars of mysticism called Roads of Excess, Palaces of Wisdom. And so I was really interested in this topic really from the 1990s on about really altered states and how intellectuals think out of their own altered states and create their scholarship. There's this like weird background to scholarship that I was really interested in. And Corbin, you know, Corbin is a really interesting figure. This category of the imaginal is very popular, and everybody thinks he came up with it, and he didn't. And what I was trying to say in that chapter is that actually the category of the imaginal goes back to 19th century Victorian psychical research. It was used by a classicist named Frederick Myers, who was using it to understand telepathy and out-of-body experiences and precognitive dreams and things like that. And he got it from entomology, the study of bugs. And basically what it meant was you had this larval stage, the creepy, crawly caterpillar, and then you had this imaginal stage, the butterfly. And what Myers was saying was that these impossible experiences are essentially buds, the evolutionary buds of some future imaginal form. And so he was looking at psychical phenomena in a kind of evolutionary context, certainly non-Darwinian, but an evolutionary context already in the 1880s. And when Corbin comes along, he coins the imaginal really not till what, the 1950s, 60s. And he means something that's between the physical world and the spiritual world of God and a kind of transcendence, an utter transcendence. And so it's helpful. I want to say Corbin is helpful because he's moving away from the common understanding of the imagination as just a generator, a kind of producer of schlock, right? To some kind of mediation, that the imagination is mediating or translating some kind of transcendent world into images and forms and symbols and mythologies or myths that we can understand. And so that first chapter, what it's really about is like, what is the imagination? And what strikes me talking to experiencers is that there's the imagination, and then there's the imagination. And there's something that happens to these people in particular altered states where the imagination becomes empowered and they see things, you know, and there's a kind of passivity to that experience that I think gets coded as revelation in the history of religions, but there's a kind of image-based revelation that takes place that then I think too often religion interprets literally or exclusively, but it's actually based on an actual experience that I think is quite common. And one of the jokes I think I tell in the book is that, look, I mean, maybe I don't tell this in the book, but if you go to the AR, just look for any discussion of symbolism today. There is none, you know? The imagination has become just the metaphor. It's become a cognitive kind of function of a material brain, and we've lost that sort of romantic notion of the imagination as a translator or a mediator of some higher reality. And so I'm trying to get back to that, but I'm trying to get back to that through the experiences of contemporary human beings who have experiences all the time, which clearly involve their imagination, but also involve physical stuff that happens in the physical environment. And how do we make sense of that? We don't. It's not possible with any of the models we have, but of course it happens all the time. And the example I give, or that I start the book with, is precognitive dreams. People have dreams all the time in which they know in great detail what's going to happen the next day or 3 weeks out or 3 years out, and down to really banal details like who's going to come into the office and walk across, and there's a traffic jam down 3 floors. I mean, they know everything. So there's something about the dream that is empirical or about space and time and history, but there's also something about the dream that's clearly a dream, that's clearly being imagined. And again, we just don't have a language for that. And I think the imaginal of Corbin helps us. But it itself is riven with theological convictions that he had that I think are problematic, frankly. But it's a good start.
Yeah, I mean, Henri Corbin occupies an interesting place within Islamic studies and Islamic intellectual history. There are critiques of his work as being too Iranocentric or tending to universalizing trends and so on. One discussion that I often end up having with my students in class about the work of Henri Corbin is this term, the imaginal. I never knew this Myers connection that you mentioned, because the word that he's translating from the Ibn Arabi tradition, the Sufi tradition, is either khayal or mithal. Alam al-mithal is the world of the example or the image or the representative illustration or something. Or khayal is literally the imagination or the imaginal. And they're both scriptural terms, and he's trying to find a fuzzy kind of word. So it's interesting that it looks like these two sources sort of gave rise to that term in his corpus, and I think it's a helpful one when he capitalizes the I, especially in imaginal. Well, one part in your book that I found helpful is where you tell the reader to think temporally, not spatially. You say things are popping in and out of walls and that kind of thing, but you're probably closer to the mark if you're thinking in terms of time. And then you evoked these theories of relativity and time swerve, and I would like you to talk a bit more about that, because the idea of linear time informing our analysis of how religion develops, I find particularly problematic, which is why in my seminars on Sufism, for instance, I don't begin with the periodization of the Sufi tradition. You work from asceticism to a little bit of a developed theory to a full-blown monism or something. I actually bring that up at the end after I've really weirded out the students with, and so they're a little bit sort of off keel once they begin to enter into this periodized discussions, so that they're not so comfortable in that sort of neat, sort of linear developmental scheme that I find very, very reductive. And so when you evoked, you said, well, we're not even thinking in relation to contemporary breakthroughs in our understanding of time. That really lit a light bulb for me. So
That takes us back to Swift Hall. Yeah, that's Ioan Kulianu. He wrote an essay I have all my grad students read. If you haven't read it, you need to go out and read it right away. It's called A Historian's Toolkit for the Fourth Dimension. A Historian's Toolkit for the Fourth Dimension. And I remember, I remember when Ioan was talking like that, and basically what he asks is, why do we think of history in Newtonian terms? We know Newton was essentially wrong. I mean, we know it works. It's true up here, but it's actually not true down here, on a kind of quantum level. And we don't really think of time and space in post-Einsteinian terms. We think of time and space in Newtonian terms. We're stuck in the 19th or 18th century. We haven't really learned our physics or shifted our imaginations into this new understanding of reality. And the temporal hermeneutic is something you see a lot in the UFO literature, by the way. Most of the discussions of UFOs are in a spatial hermeneutic. It's like, oh, how did they get here? They're millions of miles away, and there's this extraterrestrial hypothesis that I think is very naive, but that's generally how it's talked about in the public, in a completely spatial hermeneutic. If you begin to ask the question and you talk to experiencers, it's a question of when they come from, not where they come from. And then suddenly the behavior of the objects and the behavior of the entities, it all starts to make a lot of sense. And you start to see the entity as a kind of future human, or some kind of entity that is interacting with maybe its own past, to jimmy or change the knobs a little. And you start to understand why the phenomena is so concerned by things like nuclear armament and ecology, and all of these things make total sense once you shift to a temporal hermeneutic and away from a spatial hermeneutic. And so that's really the move. And the person that I use a lot in that chapter is Elliot Wolfson, who's a scholar of medieval Kabbalah. And Elliot definitely thinks temporally as well. He has a very radical notion of hermeneutics as essentially time travel. And that when you're interpreting a text from the medieval period, you're somehow engaging in some kind of time travel, and space itself can warp. And he's written on dreams and quantum physics and all kinds of things. So I think that's the direction that I'm just trying to signal in that chapter. I'm not saying that's the way to go. I'm not saying I know that, but it's certainly a hopeful and a generative idea to think in terms of time and not space.
How can I, let's say, I read Culiano's Historian's Toolkit.
Yeah.
I assign it to my students.
You do? You do that?
No, this is the example. I will very soon. I will soon.
Yeah, you should.
All right, so I read it, assign it to the students. I try to present some of the weaknesses from where I stand in terms of the intellectual history that I've worked on with this sort of linear developmental schema that dominates a lot of our sort of skewed or reductive understandings of the history of Sufism in this case. Okay, so how do I then help, or I mean, I'm sorry to ask, like what can you do without things getting out of hand in the classroom or on the page?
They're gonna get out of hand.
Okay. Yeah. You know, because you used the phrase, once you think temporally, it starts making a lot of sense. And I was thinking, it starts getting out of hand. And I mean, I've assigned readings in my class, and students have like broken out into visionary kind of worlds because the literature is potent. So how does one try to complicate and be diligent without abandoning one's critical historical duties and really embracing the weird in the classroom, or as one writes?
Yeah. So usually how that question is asked, first of all, I've heard all these questions hundreds of times. I don't mean to be critical of you, but it's true. Usually how that question is framed is, where do you draw the line? Or how do you draw the line? And my reply is always crop circles. That's a joke. People do laugh at that, by the way.
Irima will explain me the joke later.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I'm not sure you do draw the line, though. Okay. And that's really the answer to the question is, once you open this Pandora's box of actual human experience, the game is on, and a lot of our previous models actually don't work, or work up to a certain point. And I think this is what the Superhumanities was about, the book now. It was certainly an embrace of critical theory. I was essentially kicked out of a country for critical theory. I can tell you all about critical theory. But the argument of the Superhumanities is critical theory, whether it's race or gender or sexuality or history or ecology or whatever it is completely correct, but it is not adequate. It is not what is going on with these people. And if we are going to translate the humanities into some kind of narrative or story that can be picked up and heard by other people, we actually need some vertical dimension. We need something else other than a kind of naysaying that is absolutely correct again and necessary, but not adequate. And so I think that's, but thinking impossibly is very much thinking outside of one's assumptions. Right. And so when you say, what was your phrase? It gets you into trouble, or
it can quickly get out of hand.
Well, that's thinking impossibly. I mean, and I don't mean that irresponsibly. I mean, I'm a teacher too, but I think as an intellectual, what you want to do is you want to get the students and get your colleagues to thinking reflexively and critically about their assumptions and about their own worldview. And I think that's what, I know that's what Thinking Impossibly is, because I made it up, or Kyle made it up. It's very much about that. And it works through people's experiences again. Yeah. You start with people's experiences and you take them as really serious points of doing theory. They're not doing the theory, you're doing the theory, but you begin with those experiences to do your theory. So for example, the precognitive dream. You start with the precognitive dream and then you start to theorize, well, what does the universe have to look like to make this experience possible? It's now impossible, but what does the universe have to look like to make this event or this experience possible? That's really the question.
So what is it about the UFO phenomenon that you find so useful in sort of as a phenomenon to examine and to really try to think impossibly with?
I do not understand or know what a UFO is. Let's begin there. The reason, though, I find it so attractive and so powerful is it's where the public is at. It's how you have a conversation with people who are not in the study of religion or are not in the academy. You can talk about this with them, and they get very enthused and very engaged. And you can do all of this critical work, you can do all this theoretical work with that topic, with the public, and I find that really useful. I also find the UFO phenomenon a kind of exemplar or model of this because it involves both imaginative transformation and physical events. It breaks down our splitting of reality into a mental and a material dimension, and I find that really useful. I find that, frankly, intellectually delicious. But do I understand that? No. But I think that's kind of the point, you know. And people who do understand what a UFO is, they're either lying or they don't know what they're talking about. You know, those are the two things. Because nobody understands what's going on. And so when people tell me they do, or they're certain, or they're reductive about it, or they're some kind of belief system, I'm like, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for X, Y, and Z. And the temporal hermeneutic, by the way, is a part of this story that really works for some cases, and people are like, whoa, you know, I mean, it really flips people thinking temporally instead of spatially.
Yeah. Have you found any intellectual interlocutors outside who are trying to think impossibly? You mentioned in your book,
dozens.
The early physicists in the early 20th century who turned to mystical literature. To me, that sounds like an impulse toward trying to think impossibly.
It was.
In the contemporary, sort of in your own research, have you found impossible thinkers among, let's say, neuroscientists or quantum physicists or someone?
Well, and among scholars of religion and historians and anthropologists and biologists and geneticists. And I mean, you know, one of the things I do at Rice is we hold these archives of the impossible conferences, and it's impossible. I mean, to use a silly phrase, I guess. There's so much interest. There's so many people from the academy that want to speak. There's no way. There's no way. So there's, you know, just to give you an example, when we post a video of a lecture at Rice, we generally get about 500 views in the life of it, okay? We had 150,000 views in 2 weeks. So the response to this topic, both from the public but also from intellectuals and academics across the board, the humanities, the social sciences, the sciences, doesn't matter, is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And I do think, though, it's more prominent, it's more prominent among younger intellectuals than it is established intellectuals. And I have some guesses about why that is, but that's certainly what I'm seeing.
Would you hazard a few of those guesses?
You know, one of my jokes is, why are we worshiping the people we read in graduate school? Please don't do that if you're a graduate student. In other words, can we not move on? And can we not have other thoughts and other ways of looking at ourselves and the world? I mean, those are important theorists. Obviously, there's a canon. We teach the canon too at my university. But there's something about the younger intellectuals that are not as bound to these disciplinary boxes or to these theorists that I think we definitely were in the 80s and 90s. And and that has its own challenges as well, but I think there's something there. And I also think, you know, the ground has shifted, folks, frankly, on the UFO. It's really shifted. I mean, it's in the New York Times, it's in Congress, it's on the news. It has changed. If I talked about this 15 years ago, you would laugh at me. You would snicker. It's harder to do that now. You can still snicker or laugh, but there's something going on in the culture that is fundamentally changing. And I think humanists in particular have a lot to offer to that conversation, but they're not speaking out sufficiently and we're not being listened to. And I think they need to. And that's why we do these conferences. It's a kind of mainstream. It's not just the UFO. It's impossible phenomena across the board.
Right. You taught me the term dual aspect monism.
Yeah.
And I spent quite a bit of time in my class convincing students that you can't put some of the authors we read in my courses, like Afifuddin Tirimsani, Ibn Arabi, and others. You can't quite put them in a box because they don't want to be in a box. And so we have a problem in talking about these figures just as intellectual historians within my subfield. And there's a number of words: pantheism, panentheism, monism, a whole slew. Dualism. Yes, and a dual aspect monism almost caught it for me. Especially how you describe it as sort of reality is one, and we split it in two, into the mental and the material. But ontologically, it's untrue, and I guess epistemologically, it's a functional way of getting around. And so I'm drawn to try to experiment with that term, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it, because it seems to be a term that resists what the Sufis call knots of belief, because a belief or a creed in Arabic, or uqda, literally means a knot. And these authors that I'm working with are saying, no, we don't have a creed, they're playing on word. In other words, we're trying to untie every knot.
Thinking impossible.
Right. And so I can't say the dual aspect monism. I mean, anyway, within my work, it's still very difficult to categorize these impossible thinkers. Yeah. So, speak about dual aspect monism for a minute.
It's an abstract expression. It's boring, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, come on. Dual aspect monism? It puts you to sleep, just saying the thing. But people will ask at some point, okay, so what do you think? And dual aspect monism comes out of a conversation I've had with a quantum physicist named Harold Ottman-Spacher for 20 years now. And it comes out of the philosophy of mind. Mm-hmm. And it comes out of the history of physics, history of science. And it essentially means what you just said. It means that the world is one, but the human is two. In other words, we split reality into a mental and a material dimension. But actually, deep down, it's not two. It's monistic. I find that helpful, but I'm happy to get rid of that. Use some other. If you have a better term, tell me. I mean, I'm happy to use whatever term works. But one of the things I have to deal with a lot is people who tell me that these physical events somehow correspond perfectly to some mental event. And that actually makes a lot of sense in a dual aspect monistic world, because the mental and the material is split off the same reality. And that reality down there, which we can't get to as human egos, is not mental and it's not material. It's a both and or a neither nor. It's very Buddhist. So dual aspect monism just helps me think about the events and the experiences that I want to think about. And also, there's also a heavy critique in the book about monotheism, frankly, and the history of monotheism and its battle with what they call magic, which is essentially this dual aspect monism again. And I think this is one of the real strong moral impulses of the method in the book, is that for millennia now, monotheistic traditions have essentially beat up on people's experiences with the world that correspond or match up, which are then framed as witchcraft or black magic or however they're framed. I mean, they're always framed with some kind of racist or negative term. And you see that today. I still run into that all the time. I live and teach in Texas, by the way. And these experiences are often called demonic. They're often called instances of possession or magic, and so I worry about that history of condemnation and rejection, because it doesn't fit into a particular theology. Is really what, and this dual aspect monism is just an attempt to sort of validate people's experiences. Really, again, it really begins with people.
I mean, your critique of of monotheism doesn't map onto the text and the understandings and the educational formation that I'm trained in.
Fantastic.
To a certain extent, perhaps, but we don't have witch hunts. We don't have. I mean, most heretics died warm in their bed in the Islamic tradition, and there was sort of course, there was a citadel of, let's say, theological orthodoxy that kept shifting its boundaries as various traditions developed. Of course, there are many of the horror stories that you describe in your work that, to some extent, play out in other dynamics within Islamic tradition. I find maybe that's a knot of belief. Your critique there might be a knot of belief itself in response to other knots of belief. Perhaps the sharpness of the critique. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if your understanding, when you evoke the term monotheism, if we're understanding the same term.
It's a response, Yousef, to my context in Texas. It's a response to evangelical Christianity. It's a response to my own tradition I grew up with, Roman Catholicism, which developed a whole demonological discourse, a discourse of heresy to deal with these weird experiences that I find very troubling. It's not a critique of Sufism, for sure. I mean, one of the things I'm really interested in is the way the early quantum physicists, they really did turn to comparative mystical literature, like instantly. Yeah. I mean, they went right to the Upanishads, they went right to Sufism, they went right to Aldous Huxley and perennial philosophy, because that was what made sense to them about this quantum world that they were trying to map, and why it did not fit into the Newtonian social ego that we're familiar with up here. And the physicists themselves, people like Schrodinger and Bohr and you know, all these sorts of people, Pauli, they turned immediately to this stuff, the stuff we're talking about. So these mystical traditions, I think, are the beginning of an answer to this. Right. But we have rejected it. We have, you know, academics, at least when I was in graduate school, 1978 was the turn away from all of this stuff into a kind of, you know, mysticism is always constructed and it's always local and it's about language and culture and religion. We have rejected exactly what I think can help us here.
I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah.
So I want to now open the floor to the audience so we can take some questions.
Yeah.
You want me? Oh, all right.
And the questions are over now, is that right?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming. No, I'm being silly.
Tiffany, do you want me to moderate to call the? All right, sure. Lean, why don't you'd like to start us off? Yes. Could you go to the microphone? Lean is my PhD student who's working on contemporary discourses on contemplating the Quran in the 20th century.
Okay.
She's Indonesian.
I have a very brief question. Thank you for the conversations. It was very enlightening. So you were talking about thinking impossibly in terms of, like, not thinking in terms of any religion, any bound, like, any limited box, any particular model. What do you mean by that? And what does it do? And why is thinking of impossibly within the context of a particular tradition is a problem? Thank you.
Oh, well, that's a great question. I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, this came up a little in our conversation this morning. One of the things that you see when you look at impossible phenomena is that they happen everywhere and to everyone. They're not bound by a particular culture or tradition. And that's, I think, theoretically really interesting. Whether a particular tradition is necessary or required or valued or not, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But I do work with materials that have tried to develop forms of spirituality that are not part of these traditional cultures. And the spiritual but not religious, the human potential movement, the New Age, different languages for these things. But I'm really interested in those modern, very modern attempts to disaffiliate from traditions and to develop some kind of spirituality or some kind of vision that is not located in a culture or tradition. But I don't assume that's a good thing. I mean, we are local, social beings. We speak particular languages, we live in particular cultures, we eat particular foods. I mean, there's a lot of particularity about us. But I think if you just start thinking about religion, for example, or the impossible, it gets global really quickly. And it gets even non-human. It sort of stretches the boundaries, it explodes them really, of what we think the human is, much less what we think a particular religious identity is. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but those are some thoughts. I also, I'm riffing too. I think, I teach our introduction to the study of religion at Rice, and one of the things I do in that class is I don't have any of the religions. I just teach them how to think comparatively about religion and give them all kinds of theories and methods. And, the joke I tell them is I don't want to be your Wikipedia. I don't want to spend weeks and weeks telling you the content of this tradition and that tradition and that tradition. I only have you for 4 months. You're probably only going to take one religion course your whole life. So let's not spend the time learning things you can learn on Wikipedia. Let's learn to think about religion is really what. But that's a global kind of comparative process. That's not a local one necessarily.
I'll take the second question.
Thank you for the talk. I guess, Yousef, you brought up knots of belief and unwinding them, and in Buddhism, the Buddha talks about not holding to fixed views. And I don't know if that was a similar point, but I guess, do you guys ever think about, that we might come to greater understandings of the ultimate nature of what's going on by, unhooking from perspectives, or more limited perspectives that come from specific beliefs or views, and that then, ultimately that's why it would be hard to convey a more total understanding of what's going on because it isn't possible with birds?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what the book's about, is you know, it's the complexity or the paradox of belief. I mean, belief makes possible a lot of things that are impossible. And people have experiences, I think, in some cultures that they don't have in others precisely because of their belief system. So I don't think belief is necessarily a block here, but it does determine one's reality. And you know, I'll give you an example from Catholic history in this case. Human levitation. Carlos Ayer at Yale wrote a book called They Flew, and it's about all of the archival evidence for people floating or flying in 16th and 17th century Spain and Italy, really. It's really Italy and Spain. But he goes into this whole question of the earliest debates were about agency. It actually wasn't about the phenomenon. It was about whether this was from God or was this from the devil. And this is kind of my concerns earlier. But the belief system, I think, enabled certain people to float or fly, is what I'm trying to say. And I think our contemporary belief system in American secular culture just thinks that's nonsense. And so people don't. You know, I mean, that's a mind blower right there, right? And so there's something about belief and that enables, but there's also something about belief that shuts down. I don't think it's ever a free lunch, as it were. And I feel the same way about my own critical theory and secular convictions too. I think it makes certain things possible, and I think it shuts down certain things. And I feel personally, now I'm speaking personally, I feel exiled and removed from my family. Okay? What do I say? What do I say when I go home to Nebraska? I say nothing, by the way. Okay? So I live in a university context that assumes X, Y, and Z, as I do, but I also come from a culture that assumes A, B, and C. And I'm so aware of that conflict. And it's a conflict about belief, by the way. It really is. And I really think academics and intellectuals believe certain things, and they don't recognize those as beliefs, but they are. And I think the people that you know are of these religions that we're trying to study, I think we're comfortable saying they believe X, but sometimes they don't either. It's really complicated, you know. And even with something like human levitation, and we got into this a little this morning. These people who floated had no control over it. They didn't want it to happen. So it wasn't about willing something or them, you know, wanting this to happen. They, in fact, were terrified of it and suffered for it and suffered because of it and were often basically imprisoned for it. So this isn't a happy kind of, you know, superpower. This is a phenomenon that is about trauma and suffering, and the culture inevitably tries to shut it down, inevitably. And so I worry about that, you know, and I think about that a lot, particularly when people come to me and tell me their stories, and they're inevitably stories about impossible things that their culture, usually their religious culture, is trying to shut down. So that to me is the moral impulse behind this work.
Just build a little bit on what you're saying here, is, especially in context of going to Nebraska, not saying anything. One term that I found very useful in the text that I study is the term i'tibar, meaning to cross over or a standpoint. And i'tibari type thinkers are these impossible thinkers who posit that yes, belief both enables and disables, it both veils and reveals, it blocks and it opens. And therefore, in order not to collapse into absolute relativism on the one hand, or blind, firm, zealous, literal conviction on the other, they seek a standpoint, to understand the standpoint, that is to say, some kind of underlying substrate of truth that's refracted in different ways from different perspectives, so that even in Nebraska with let's say, speaking to someone with blinders, one can still detect some refraction, some i'tibar, some standpoint. These authors do this with dunderhead anthropomorphists who talk about whether God cuts his nails or not. And they say, well, actually, from a certain perspective, there's some truth to that debate. And I wonder if that's a helpful one, or is it too wishy-washy, or is it?
No, it's helpful. I mean, if our culture, if public culture adopted essentially a mystical comparativism, which is really what you're talking about, I think we'd be in a much better place right now. I think it'd be a dramatically better place. Would it solve everything? No. No story, no worldview solves everything. One of the things I tell my grad students is I like jokes. I have a lot of jokes. People never laugh, but I tell them anyway. One of my jokes is you have no business being a scholar of religion until you've lost at least 2 worldviews. And they look at me and they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, look, if you haven't lost a religious worldview, you still think that worldview is adequate, and it's not. And so you can't study religion, not at least effectively. If you have lost one world, the chances are very high you've just jumped into another. And I'll bet it's secular scientism. I'll bet. And you think that's adequate. Well, once you lose that world, then you start to say, well, wait a minute, maybe a third world isn't going to solve everything. Maybe it isn't about jumping into another world. Maybe I should stand back and start questioning. And that's when you become, I think, at least the kind of intellectual I want to help train. I'm not interested in training the person who hasn't lost any worldview or lost only one worldview, because I don't think they can really think about religion, in a comparative fashion. They can definitely become experts on a religion, but they can't think about religion theoretically, and that's really what I'm trying to get at.
Let's take the next question. Sorry, there was a line.
I'm going to shut this window because I can't just. It's hard for me to hear. Maybe I'm not going to shut it.
I'll shut it while you listen to the question.
Tiffany, can you shut? Because I can't hear them. There's bells ringing out there. And
there's a UFO that's going to land on the quad in a minute.
There's no UFO out there.
And it'll be your fault.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Khaldun Swais. I teach philosophy actually at the city colleges.
Okay.
So I heard about your lecture and here I am. Well, thank you for being here and what you did.
Okay.
As an academic, I strive for trying to find the truth behind things. It's the essence of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
But the distinction between what is BS, what is a hallucinogenic delusion people have of Elvis this morning, drinking too much coffee or whatever, as opposed to actually meeting an angel or a demon or whatever. The Vatican, for example, tries to distinguish between an authentic exorcistic event or a possession. Before they send out the priests from Rome, they'll pay their plane tickets. They want to find out, is this real or not? And then they send it out to investigate. Even the Catholic Church does that. Do you have in your book and your criteria and your evaluation between what is an authentic? Everybody has experiences authentic on one level. What I mean is concretely, third-personally reliable, as opposed to, too much coffee, too much spaghetti, or whatever it is I've had, and therefore I'm seeing Elvis again.
Yeah, I get asked that.
That's why, that's 2 basic questions. That's not
circles. The answer is cross.
Go ahead.
Finish away.
The second one?
Do you want me to answer that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I, again, grew up, I know a lot about Roman Catholicism and how strange events are judged worry me a lot. because they're taken off the table if they conflict with the church teachings. And they're left on the table if they don't conflict. And yes, then there's a kind of empirical, kind of legal process to determine whether they're true or not, but it's very much, do these fit into this Catholic theology? And so that's precisely what I'm arguing against. I also trouble or complicate this notion of hallucination or psychedelic, or you use the word coffee. I don't know about coffee. I like coffee. I'm not going to go there. But I don't think impossible phenomena are exclusive to mental pathology, by the way. In other words, I think I work with a model of the mind-brain relationship that's a kind of filter model, and basically what it says is that the brain is filtering or mediating or translating consciousness, it's not producing it. And so what I look for is moments of trauma in which that filter is compromised and other aspects of reality can get in. And frankly, mental illness is one of them. So I really worry about declaring somebody mentally ill or crazy because they had a precognitive or a telepathic experience. Because I think those two things can happen together. And it's not that there's not such a thing as mental illness, it's not that there's not such a thing as mental pathology, but it's not exclusive to these phenomena. So that, and I would also say the same thing about trick and fraud. I always bring up the placebo effect here. The truth is, there's something about human beings that need to be tricked into the truth. I don't know what it is, but trickery and fraud and an actual phenomenon that actually is happening are not exclusive again. Now, sometimes they are. To answer your question in another way, this is why I focus on experiencers who do not share these stories, do not benefit from them, do not promote them in the public media. They usually happen spontaneously, and they usually are in conflict with whatever the cultural inheritance or the family tradition is. So that's a kind of vague criteria, I guess, that I do use. But again, it goes back to this question, this joke about crop circles. I don't know we can draw a line. And I think once we open that box, all kinds of stuff come in.
And that leads to the second question. Does that mean you fundamentally don't believe in an objective truth that we can all see?
I don't think, yeah, I do believe certainly I believe in objective truth. But I think impossible phenomena are part of that. You know, I think these things happen to everyone everywhere because of that cosmic condition that human beings are in and are. Do I understand them? No, but I think that's part of the answer, whatever the answer is. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Silence.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your talk today.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I am very interested in general and within the Islamic tradition, particularly Ibn Arabi, is imagination.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a few more questions about that.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what are some aspects of Corban's theory of imagination that you found unsatisfying or unconvincing? Yeah. And also, have you found any alternative theories that you think could complement, like, the convincing aspects of this theory? And lastly, from the research that you've done, have you worked out a theory of imagination yourself that would help you make sense of strange happenings?
Yeah, the answer to the last question is no. The thing about Corban that I want to think about some more, but that does worry me, is the kind of theological or philosophical commitments that he's making. One of the scholars I talked to was Antoine Favre, who knew Corban, personally, and told me on many occasions that Corban was docetic, you know, in the sense that he certainly denied that God can become a human being, and he had this very transcendent kind of monotheism or theism at work. And the imaginal was this middle space that I think allowed him to affirm transcendence and immanence at the same time. And incarnational theology or philosophy is of course a Christian response to that same problem. How do we relate utter transcendence to utter immanence? And so I don't know how we do that, but I think Corban's response is one response. And I think it's clearly the response of a lot of Islam as well. But again, remember, I'm a comparativist. I want to listen to the Buddhist response, and and there are many of those, by the way, not just one, and every other response. And I think once we can put, you know, 100 theories of the imagination on the table, I think we'll be closer to what's actually going on. So it's not that I want to deny or reject Corban, it's that I don't want to be bound to that particular theological project.
And were there any like alternative theories that you felt like could complement it well to kind of move towards like a universal theory of imagination?
I don't think anybody understands what the imagination is, and I think it's impossibly weird. And I mean that in a positive sense. And I think it's the future of us thinking about this, but also art and film, and I don't think we have integrated. For example, we haven't really integrated quantum physics into our worldview. I mean, we still talk about the sunset, for God's sake. I mean, that's 400 years ago. We learned that one was wrong. And here we still are, talking about a sunset and a sunrise. So there's something about our language and the way we imagine things and the way we dream that is so caught in these earlier cosmologies and these earlier systems that it's really frustrating, you know. And then let me give you an example. I don't mean to go on this, but I'll give you an example. And Yousef, this is a good example, because the impossible always comes down to people's experience. That's really the beginning of this. So I have a colleague, she's the project manager for our Archives of the Impossible. Her name is Karen Austin. She's in the book at some length. When Karen was a young woman in her 20s, she was on her bed, she was awake, and what she describes as a mechanical bug came out of nowhere and crawled up on her chest and interacted with her mind in a telepathic way. And when she talks about that, this isn't a dream event. This isn't an apparition. This is a physical event. She calls it mechanical. She draws it. She imagines. We have an actual image of it that she worked with the artist to recreate. What do we do with that? That doesn't fit in to any of none of the worldviews I know about, or none of the traditions I know about. And then when I say to her something like, well, it's AI, it sounds like it's some kind of mechanical, and it looks exactly like an alien, by the way, when you see it. It's got big eyes, and it's mechanical, and you can tell. And okay, that's what I mean. And when I talk about it as AI and as a kind of future something, and we don't actually know who's interacting with her, we don't actually know what the source of that alien bug is. She agrees, you know, she totally agrees, but she will insist on the physicality of that mechanical bug. And that's what I just want to sit with and say, we don't know. We don't know. Please don't tell me you know what that is. Because you don't. Nobody knows. And that's what I mean about thinking impossibly, is starting with these sorts of experiences that just shatter. You know, the phrase that was used in the 90s was ontological shock, which, by the way, Paul Tillich invented, but it was a phrase that was used in the 90s to describe this utter sense of disarray that these experiencers experienced, because what they were experiencing did not fit in to what they thought was real. Any sense. So anyway, I'm sorry to go on like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take the next question.
I'm so sorry, by the way. I was sitting in the second row. I didn't see there was a whole line of people. My name is Sydney. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry I walked in late. I had class, so I don't know if you might have already answered my question, but if I understood correctly, you said no one really knows what UFOs are. If they do, they're liars, or they just don't know what they're talking about. I guess I'm curious, respectfully, where or how do you have authority on this, if it's like a part of someone else's spirituality, or you seem akin to understanding other phenomena that are sort of out of sorts, but why do you draw the line on the definition of UFOs and how people understand them?
So I don't know if I understood the whole question.
So your claim that nobody understands what a UFO is,
Yeah.
she's interested in that strong line that you drew versus other, perhaps other impossible phenomena that we can start to make some sense of within some loose dual aspect monist worldview, for instance.
The UFO in particular, there's so many models of it. There's so many things going on, and when I hear people who are certain of it, they don't know that literature. They don't know those models, and that's why I say those things. There's a lot of certainty around that particular phenomena that I think is just misplaced, because I think there's a history there and there's a literature there that is extremely diverse and does not land on any particular model or sense of what they are. So I do really think that. I don't think people we can't develop a causal or scientific explanation for things like telepathy or precognition, although people do try. I think it's a similar situation, but it seems to me it's different than the UFO phenomenon, because it's so weird, it's so absurd. You know, a lot of the visionary displays or a lot of the encounters they seem absurd by intention. They seem staged. And I don't think we get that same kind of sensibility from people talking about some kind of telepathic communication with a child or knowing what's going to happen before it happens.
Jeff, let me I want to build on what Storai says, since I have a mic in front of me. So if you speak about UFOs to a Muslim conservative practicing Sunni community, okay? If at first there's the disavowal and the eyebrows moving in different directions and all that, but then you can say, look, in the Islamic tradition, there's the evil eye, there's this, there's that, and suddenly the stories become sort of they start opening up, all right? Then the framework of the UFO maps nicely onto jinn. And I want to ask you why you wouldn't accept that framework. Yeah. So jinn, we have 7th century reports of jinn abductions. We have 12th century reports of jinn giving unbreakable, like supernatural swords to Muslim fighters fighting the Mongols, for instance. And so they have this superior tech of the time. They have these abduction capacities. We have trials in the 7th, 8th century where jinn abductions was taken into account under the caliphate of Umar, the second caliph, and so on. So for let's say within an Islamic framework, jinn equals UFO has been sort of the standard answer. I want you to press back on that.
Is that close to the question? Or next year?
the credibility of saying we don't know the what a UFO is and the authority of making that statement.
Once we put jinn on the table, and we're talking about it, I'm happy. I'm happy if we put jinn on the table and we start talking seriously about it. I'll give you an example. I have a friend named Eric Wargo, and he writes about precognitive dreams. And he writes about them as a materialist. And basically what Eric thinks is that we're spread out in 4 or 5 dimensions, and that what's happening in a precognitive event is that the brain is physically perceiving some event the next day or in the future, and it's retrocausally influencing itself within that physical brain. I like that. I don't know if that's true, but it keeps it on the table. That's the criterion. It keeps the phenomena on the table, and we can start talking about models. The jinn model of these phenomena, I'm very sympathetic with. It's a theological framework, though, too, and I suppose that's what worries me, and where my authority comes from. I don't know if I have any authority, to be really honest. But I don't think anybody else does either when it comes to these phenomena. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And I do think, like the UFO, let's go back to the UFO. I am the guy in the UFO community who says, look, this has something to do with the dead. This is about souls, you know? And we have exiled the soul from our modern worldview, and therefore we've, you know, they show up as science fiction spacecraft from Venus or something, or from some other star system. So I really I like the mixing up of these phenomena, because I do think they're related. I think they're connected, but I don't think anybody understands how they're connected. And I think the jinn conversation is certainly a way to connect them. But again, what do we do with Karen's experience? You know, with the mechanical AI bug on her chest. I don't know how does that fit into the jinn, or?
Easily, but what I worry about, well, you said the theological framework worries you. What worries me is that once you tell, let's say, a Muslim audience, Karen had an encounter with a jinn, then curiosity is killed. So the interest in really expanding knowledge, because you're able to suddenly contain that event and sort of put it on the shelf, and it doesn't do enough. But at least the event is accommodated culturally and societally, and you're not.
Let me try to get at your question a different way. Again, let's go back to the Catholic thing, which is related to the jinn thing. I just worry about the ways that religious ideologies or belief systems exile or literally demonize particular phenomenon. And I think human beings will often then experience those phenomena as demons. You know, I think the human experience responds to the interpretation of them in some kind of really bizarre way we don't quite understand. So that's what I mean when I say that nobody understands the UFO. There are certainly interpretations, but they have all kinds of political and ethical and moral impact that disturbs me, frankly. So my language about you're either lying or ignorant, I suppose is partly polemical. Because I'll give you an example. I think most of the UFO stuff is a Cold War invasion narrative. I think it's about fear. I think it's about the alien is the immigrant, is the other. It's about protecting a nation state, an airspace. It's really dangerous. It feeds into that kind of worldview. And I think Hollywood, the UFO movies for decades was in that Cold War invasion narrative. And you get a film like Arrival, it starts to break with that narrative. It starts to dramatically break with that narrative. but it's focused, if you've seen the movie, on a female linguist, right, who basically exposes herself to this alien presence to try to understand its language. And as she learns the language, she starts to have these precognitive experiences. So it's basically about precognition and language, and there's a kind of Sapir-Whorf kind of model of language and reality going on there. But the military's there, but it doesn't do anything. You know? The physicist is there, the male physicist, of course, is there, but he doesn't do anything, really. So that cinematic storytelling breaks with this Cold War invasion narrative that I guess I am critical of it. And I don't think they know what they're talking about. Somebody needs to say that. If I'm not going to say it, who's going to say that? Somebody needs to say that.
We have one last question. Or Tiffany, two questions?
No, I'm just going to close this out.
Yeah, Tiffany's the moderator.
Correct.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Professor Kripal. I really like your Esalen book. I found that very fascinating. It made me really think about, and I mean, overall your work too, just talking about the kind of interconnection between scientific discourses and religion, the way they're both in tension and also in dialogue with one another. But I guess one of the biggest difficulties I've been having in understanding your work. I'm incredibly sympathetic towards your call for the religious studies of a comparative mysticism, as you call it, where in this archive of the impossible, we bring in these multiple religious perspectives in order to try to analyze them better, try to see how they relate to the human condition. But I think that the biggest tension I've been having is the way that you kind of both mention what I would say like subjective or psychological association. So for example, earlier today, but I'm sure in your book you talked about the association between poltergeist phenomenon and traumatic experiences, and also just recently about UAP, UFOs, and near-death experiences. But then at the same time, you also talk about how, with the congressional hearings are happening, they're proving that these things are actually real. But obviously, we still don't know further beyond that. They're definitely very divorced from these many, first-person accounts we're having of people's, interactions or abductions by them. So for me, and of course, maybe you don't want to reduce that tension if that's what it means to think impossibly, to hold these two contradictory thoughts at the same time. But I don't know exactly how to wrestle with that, where you're trying to say, oh yeah, it's also associated with this psychological phenomenon, but at the same time, there's this objective correlate. So I would love to hear you just more talk about that science and religion aspect more. Thank you.
So I'm not sure I understand the question, other than the science and religion. I can answer the science and religion. Is that okay? I mean, I don't mean to avoid the critical question. I just don't understand it. I do think religious experience of certainly the people I interact with are informed by science, but often on a kind of a level that they're not aware of or they don't control. So for example, just to speak practically here again, when people have near-death experiences, they don't go to purgatory and see the Virgin Mary, right? They pop into another dimension, or they see a galaxy or something, so they're living in a context of a kind of Big Bang cosmology, a kind of universe that is not the universe of our ancestors 500 years ago. And they've been informed by hyperdimensional thought, for 150 years, from Abbott and Hinton on. So I do think there's a profound relationship there, but I think it's, you talked about the comparative mystical view. I feel like I'm just a kid from Nebraska who went to the Divinity school here, and it's just trying to ask questions about religion with a capital R across the board. And it's like, it seems obvious to me that, like the flying saucer we heard about today, those things show up everywhere, by the way, just like that, exactly like that, like the Sheikh described. What does that mean? What does that mean? It clearly means something. And so I'm always, I guess I do resist my, the Catholicism I grew up with, not because it was bad or wrong on its own terms, but because it's just so local. It's just so relative. And so I keep asking for this comparative theory because I want us to be big and I want us to think about each other in a different kind of way. And I think science is interesting to me. First of all, it's won the narrative, by the way, if you haven't noticed. And it's because they say cool things. And they talk about universal questions. And we don't. So of course they won. So I think that's what attracts me to the sciences. And physicists in particular, first of all, they're weird. They're really weird. But they're weird because they know that reality isn't what we think it is. And so they have this, but they think about reality in a cosmic way, not in a local or traditional way. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's Tiffany's. It's time. It's time to go.
Well, here's to being weird and saying cool things. I wanted to thank you, Jeff, for your authorial voice and for your presence among us.